You know, with all the Star Wars spin-offs that we're getting lately, do you think we'll get one about the Bantha getting to make little Bantha babies? I'm sure it's gonna be a little adorable. Hello, interwebs, it's another week and another review of Star Wars, The Book of Boba Fett, this time Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm. As per usual, I'll stay spoiler-free first, and then we'll get into spoilers and sort of a breakdown of the plot in just a little bit, but staying spoiler-free, I think after last week's episode, which I think pretty much everyone agrees was a distinct step down for this series overall, and I think actually some people got fairly vitriolic in their hate for last week's episode, which let's not even get into discussion of that side of things. I disliked last week's episode, but by no means did I think it was utter crap like some people were saying. But regardless, it was a distinct step down. This episode, I think, is a much better step up for the series. And while it does have some of the frustrations that I've been feeling overall, namely the heavy focus on flashbacks rather than the actual propelling narrative that I think most of us came into this show for, what does excite me is, one, that flashback was used to really strong effect here because it showcased how Fennec and Boba Fett came to meet and grew a relationship as we saw them eventually appear in The Mandalorian Season 2. So I liked sort of filling in that little backstory that a lot of us were wondering about, as opposed to the other flashbacks that we've been getting this series that were kind of answering questions that none of us had a ton of interest in prior to the show, but certainly are informative to Boba's state of mind going into the series proper and sort of the state of mind that he's trying to build in the present day. So it's not unimportant. But this was a backstory that answered questions that we had been asking for quite a while. And so that helped this narrative a little bit more. And the second thing that helped this flashback was that it finally brought us all the way up to the present day of the show. So we kind of have everything that we need to know about Boba's backstory between the end of Return of the Jedi and where we are in the present day, with the little gap filled in by Mandalorian Season 2 and everything that happened over there with Boba Fett. So that hopefully means that this show's over-reliance on flashbacks are now hopefully done, and the last half of this series can really just go headlong into dealing with the present day storyline that I think all of us are way more interested and invested in overall. So on both those fronts, I think this episode really worked. It has a strong narrative in its flashbacks, and it kind of brought an end to them, so it felt much more worthwhile to at least get them out of the way, say they're done, and get us forward. And then that brings us to the present day storyline, which again is another place setting episode, hopefully setting us up for the grand sort of latter half of the series, with Boba Fett working and getting allies and people on his side, sort of building his team that we've been kind of seeing basically, again, repetitively over the past few episodes. So at the end of the day, staying in my spoiler-free zone to sort of wrap up my thoughts on this, I have to say this is a much stronger episode. It feels like it is telling a much more cohesive story around Boba Fett, and is frustrating to a degree in that it is still staying within the same formula that this show has been doing repeatedly over and over again, namely flashbacks and also Boba Fett just building his team in the present day, rather than actually propelling any narrative forward in any distinctly new way. It does show signs of this being the last of this type of episode. So if that is the case, and that's what's happening going forward with this series, and it does focus more on the present day, it propels that and actually moves that forward in a different way than we've been seeing so far, I'm willing to let this episode get a little bit of a pass because it is a much stronger focused story that is still formulaic for this series. So liked it. It still has a lot of the problems that we've seen with this series, but shows signs of moving the series beyond them, and it was solid enough in what it was doing. So overall, like this episode, and I'm excited to see where it's going to show this series going forward. But with all that said, that is my spoiler-free thoughts. So if you want my spoiler-filled thoughts and my breakdown of the episode, we're going to get into that right now. So as I said in my spoiler-free section, the episode begins with the back-to-tank of flashbacks, apparently. Again, bringing us into a long, extended flashback sequence that this episode, for the most part, focuses on for the first two-thirds of it. And we see that Boba is currently hanging out with a bantha in the desert, and I also really love this characterization that we've been getting of Boba throughout the series, that he is actually a very big animal lover. Like, between the Rancor, the bantha, and a few other animals that we've seen here and there, he's just a big old animal lover, which I actually kind of like for his character. It's a nice little characterization to give to him, that he has that. But we also see that he is staking out Jabba's palace once Bib Fortuna was in charge after Return of the Jedi, basically, as we later learn, wanting to get back his ship, which we're not calling the name of that ship out because it's a problematic name, so we're just going to call it Boba's ship. And even the show's like kind of aware. It's like, yeah, we can't really say the name of that ship anymore, can we? Well, anyways, moving on. The one question that I do have with this whole setup of him wanting to get his ship back, it makes sense, and it's a nice way for him to eventually get Fennec on his side and them working together, but I do wonder why he couldn't have just gone up to Bib Fortuna and asked. Yes, certainly he does have a grudge against Bib Fortuna, as we see him play out, but at this point, to my mind, Bib Fortuna didn't really know that he was dead, and I don't think had a problem with Boba, as we saw in Return of the Jedi. So I feel like Boba could just be going in and being like, hey, I work for Jabba. Can I get my ship back? And then if Bib Fortuna turned him down, which Bib Fortuna might have done, then we could see this whole scenario play out. But we didn't get that scene, so it's sort of like a little bit of an assumption that there was a grudge between Bib Fortuna and Boba. Maybe I missed it, but it was just one of those things where I'm like, I buy it, but I wish we had gotten a scene where he had gone to Bib and Bib said, nah, I'm keeping the ship because it's mine. You're nobody, and get out of my hair. But regardless, it's not that big a deal, but it was just something I was thinking about. But at the same time, Boba does see a flash in the desert, and we go and find the body of Fennec Shan. So we are now caught up with the events of Mandalorian Season 1, and we eventually learn how Fennec survived the events of running in with our good friend Mando, as he brings her over to these sort of cyberpunk kids, and the same sort of like group that we've been sort of associating with back in last episode. And I find it funny, a lot of the vitriol on last episode kind of focused on the group of kids that were these like cyberpunk, like people who augmented themselves. And I'm kind of surprised by that. I get maybe that it might be a little bit too cyberpunky and feel a little bit out of place in this world, but to a degree, to me, it actually kind of makes sense that we would have kind of cyberpunk people augmenting themselves in the Star Wars universe. That I'm actually kind of surprised that we haven't really seen that before in Star Wars, at least any of the canon Star Wars TV shows that I can really think of, or movies. I mean, I've seen some people in the background with like headsets and stuff on, but I feel like it does make sense that people would augment themselves in this world, and that would kind of be an underground, like teenage kind of movement doing that. And I actually kind of like the look of it, because they do have like pistons and things. It's not like overly like cyberpunk digital, and it kind of still fits within the tactile, more worn, sort of more like I said, tactile feel of the Star Wars universe, as opposed to the digital age that we would see most other sci-fi universes have. So I don't know, I like this element of world building, and I was kind of surprised by a lot of people disliking that element of last episode. Maybe it was just the fact that they were like edgy teens and that aesthetic as opposed to the cyberpunk stuff. But for me, I actually quite enjoyed it, and I think it worked here. And I liked that he brought Fennec back with that, and that sort of explains why she's still alive and how she's got this sort of gut of pistons that I think we saw back in Mandalorian Season 2. And we also realized that he brought her back to life, not because he wants her for, to use her, but to get an ally in his fight to get his ship back. But I like that he treats her completely with respect. He says, like, oh, I'm more valuable to you alive, assuming that he wants to get her bounty. But then he says, no, you're more valuable to me alive because I value you as a person. And we're sort of seeing the change in character that Boba had after his time spent with the Tusken Raiders. And so I liked that, again, sort of like showing subtle differences in how he's being characterized within the show and how he's changed as a person. Also, the sequence with Fennec getting remade reminded me of that, like, $6 Million Man spin-off show, Bionic Woman, which, by the way, I remember as a kid watching that, like, remake of Bionic Woman that only lasted 1 year and had Katie Sackhoff in it. Does anyone remember that show? I liked that show. It was not great, but I just have weird, fond memories of that, like, one random spin-off Bionic Woman show that existed. Anyways, we get a cute little bantha scene, and then we also get Boba sort of talking to Fennec, and again, showing respect for her and showing that he values her and that he's willing to work with her after this, and actually wants to show her loyalty and actually see her as a person and treat her as an equal, as opposed to just someone hiring her. And so I again, like that whole sequence. And then the whole breaking into Bib Fortuna's palace sequence was also a lot of fun. I especially loved the breaking into Bib Fortuna's kitchen, and the droids there. We get the choppy droid and the small small, tiny droid. I thought that was like a fun little bit of physical comedy that you get in a lot of different Star Wars things, and I think it fit the mood of Star Wars in general. And so I thought that was just a fun little bit of action comedy that we went in here. And then again, the whole sequence with him getting back his ship, a lot of fun. It worked really well with them working together. Boba's going out, and then he goes and just basically murders the biker gang, which again, I liked his just sort of ruthlessness in murdering them, but I do like the little hint that we get here that it's kind of weird that the bikers were able to beat the Tusken Raiders. The Tuskens should have been able to beat them, and that's probably alluding to the fact that the Pikes, the villains in the present day, might be revealed later on in the series to be the reason that the Tuskens died, and that sort of instigates Boba wanting to get revenge on them, which I think is kind of a little bit, well, it will be a nice way to tie these flashbacks into emotional core for Boba. I think we'll see if that eventually plays out. I'm assuming that's will be what eventually happens. But then we get a little bit of a weird sequence that I both thought was cool and a little bit dumb at the same time, because Boba goes and tries to get his armor back, as we last saw it at the beginning of the season, and as we know, it eventually gets sort of picked up in Mandalorian season 2 with the one sheriff dude in that season having got it and end up with Mando and leading into all that stuff. But Boba tries to go into the Sarlacc pit, which seems a little bit dumb. I feel like he should have been aware that it was going to be dangerous and tried to kill the Sarlacc pit first and then gone in, but it does lead to a fun little action sequence, and again, the building of trust between Boba and Fennec. So a little bit of stupid on Boba, but it was nice to see this little action beat and the killing of the Sarlacc pit, which if anyone ever looks into the background of Star Wars lore, the Sarlacc pit is terrifying, like terrifying Eldritch horror stuff in the Star Wars universe. So murder that thing. Murder it dead. But obviously he doesn't have his armor, and that sets us off into what happened in Mandalorian Season 2, and finally brings us to the present day. And now we're all caught up. So now that we're back in the present, Boba goes to the bar to get Chrysanthemum, I believe is how you say the name. Basically pissed off Wookiee bounty hunter dude. And we see that he is pissed off in this bar, drinking and just killing everybody. Don't get on the wrong side of an angry Wookiee is basically the lesson here. And I do like we get this moment with Bet Twi'lek. I forget the Twi'lek's actual name, but I just remember his Bet from the L Word. Tries to talk him down, but eventually doesn't. And I like Boba being like, oh, it was worth a try. You can't really talk down a Wookiee, but I like that she is able to kind of bring him down a little bit and almost talk him out. And I think they're setting something up with her character. Maybe she's actually the mayor, or she's the person in charge, or has a little bit more influence. I think they're setting up her character. She's come back too many times for her not to be important in some way. It just feels weird if she's just like a bar owner. So I think they're trying to show some sort of influence with her, maybe going on in the background. So we'll see what eventually heads out there. But Boba eventually manages to talk Chrysanthemum to be his new bounty hunter, get a little bit more muscle. Kind of nice to see him back on the team. And then he calls a meeting of all the different captains that used to work for Jabba the Hutt. And again, I like this sequence. It's a lot of fun. The Rancor has a good sense of timing, dramatic timing. I thought it was kind of fun. But I like that Boba tries to convince them to join his side, and that doesn't really work, but he does manage to convince them to stay neutral. He's like, if you stay out of it, then, I will beat these guys and you'll still be on my good side. I'll treat you equally. I just ask that you remain neutral. And so I like that he doesn't get them automatically all on his side, but he is trying to, again, build that sense of loyalty and camaraderie as opposed to oppositional and this sort of hierarchical structure. He wants to treat them all as equals, but he doesn't get them all the way to be like, yeah, we're down with Team Boba. They're still hedging their bets, which makes sense for me that he wouldn't necessarily get them fully on his side. So I like that he doesn't have a full win here, but he does manage to move the needle in his direction. And I just kind of, I liked that, like, almost win there. I thought that set the stakes appropriately. And then we end the episode with Boba sort of alluding to that they're going to buy some muscle to face off against the Pikes. Again, heading into this hopefully next episode where they start to confront the Pikes. So overall, as you can tell with this breakdown, a couple things here and there that I was a little bit frustrated with, but I think my biggest frustration with the episode is more just the fact that it's still within this standard structure of flashback for 2/3 of the episode, and then mildly moving the needle forward to the present day, mostly with him just getting more allies to his side, as opposed to actually directly dealing with the threat of the Pikes going on here. So I was a little bit frustrated by this repeat structure, but it was well done for what it was. And if it was taken in isolation without looking at the past episodes and how they mirrored this was a solid enough episode in of itself. And looking forward for what it's setting up, I think it probably, hopefully, put an end to this repeated structure. So given both of those things, I am willing to give this episode a higher bar because it does everything really solidly and sets us up, hopefully, for the future. Now, if future episodes of the show continue this weird structure, if we have more flashbacks of like Fennec stuff, without actually moving the needle forward on the present day, that will bring me back to being much more frustrated with the show. But as it stands, I liked this episode, I enjoyed it, and I'm still excited for this show going forward, but it's going to need to change things up if it really wants to keep that interest level high. So that's my thoughts on Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know what you thought of this episode of the Book of Boba Fett, and I will see you next week for another episode. Don't forget, I also have Star Trek Prodigy reviews on Thursday, and also I have my main channel, Jessie Gender. But beyond all of that, I am just glad that you're here, and I hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy, my friend.